Welcome to the Sustainable Travel Podcast. This is a podcast that interviews a range of different travelers from different backgrounds to see what sustainable travel means to them. Today, we're here with Erin Hines from Pina Travels and the Curious Tourism Podcast. Erin has been podcasting about sustainable travel for 5 years now and brings with her a wealth of industry knowledge and expertise. Hi, Erin.
Hi, thanks for having me.
No problem. How are you doing?
Good. It's early morning here. The sun is rising.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's gonna be a
nice.
nice day. I think the sun is here, which is always nice in Canadian winter.
Amazing. Well, today we're going to be talking about quite a few things, I think, but basically the main theme is going to be how tourist perceptions of a country or a place should be presented online, can be presented online, and how that can kind of influence how other people see them, right? So, Erin, can you tell us a little bit about you, how you got into sustainable travel, and just what it is that you do in general?
Sure. So I'm Erin. I'm also known as Pina Travels online. And I am a travel blogger, I would say first, and then also a travel writer and content creator. All of my channels are focused on responsible tourism. So I create travel content that's meant to encourage people to travel in a way that's better for people and for the planet. Um, and yeah, I don't have like a really firm like origin story of how I got into sustainable tourism. I would say it was kind of a slow burn.
Yeah.
Throughout my 20s, I was traveling a lot, and the more I traveled, the more I found myself noticing things about the industry that rubbed me the wrong way. I found myself having like more and more discussions with people about like things that I was observing and questioning. And I guess just over time, I started to think critically about tourism and about how I was traveling and contributing to that.
Yeah.
And yeah, eventually, in an effort to learn, I started my podcast, Curious Tourism, which is where I talk to thought leaders, experts, and just like really smart, thoughtful people about how tourism can be better.
Yeah.
And the goal is always to make it like accessible because I always tell people like I did not start out with any knowledge about this. Like I just have been learning it myself.
Yeah.
And I think it's like really important to make this information super accessible to people.
I love that. I think it's so important when we're talking about these topics to make that distinction because we all have to start from somewhere, don't we? Like, it's not
Yeah.
like anybody ever comes into this sphere with a full encyclopedia of knowledge about how sustainability and like sustainable tourism works. So I definitely try and do that too. And I think it's something that when your audience is listening to you, when they're kind of taking on board what you're saying, you're not preaching, like you're coming at it from a place of I've been there too. And
Yeah.
I also want to make, things better and go in the same direction as you guys. So I love that.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, and was it similar for sustainability, or was it kind of more of a like wow moment, or was it also gradual there as well?
Yeah, I would say like I always tell people I think of like sustainable tourism kind of as the same as responsible tourism, which like maybe doesn't sound like it makes sense, but I find people tend to associate sustainable travel with like environmental sustainability only.
Yeah.
And in my mind, sustainable travel is about more than that. It's also about sustaining culture and sustaining heritage and supporting people in the communities that are being visited.
Mhm.
Um, so I do think of like sustainable and responsible tourism as like falling under the same umbrella. The reason I tend to go with responsible tourism is because I think like people do tend to think about it in that broader sense. So like I would include sustainability under that umbrella. But at the end of the day, like I always just think like we're all using similar terms to describe like the same concept.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I phrased my question fully. I agree with you. I think sustainable and responsible tourism is the same. But so for me, when I got into this, I was traveling a lot anyway. I was a travel agent before I did this.
Mm,
And I had kind of like a gotcha moment, I guess, with sustainability, but not linked to travel because I was actually at an ex-boyfriend's house and like his housemate had a bamboo toothbrush and like kind of toothpaste tabs. And I was like, oh, what's that about? And they explained it to me and I was like, oh, like I didn't know. It sounds so silly. Like I was in my 20s, I did not know there were things that we could do that would help.
yeah.
And then for me, from there, like sustainability kind of took on a life of its own, and it was just natural that it would like bleed into travel for me. Um, So yeah, kind of sounds like it was similar for you, like you already had these thoughts and then it just came to be with travel as well.
Yeah, I would say like the things that kind of spurred it for me. I've mentioned this like on other shows. I lived in Venice, Italy for a
Mm.
couple months when I was 20, and living in the heart of like over tourism
Yeah.
was just like that. I started just to notice things and like question things, especially because I was like living there during like peak season and like really feeling the impact of it.
Mhm.
It was like really hard not to start thinking about like over tourism. And
Yeah.
then similarly, like I just would notice like tourist behavior a lot and find it really troubling. And so it was those like little things that just started to make me think about it more broadly.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think for me as well, it was wildlife. Wildlife was
Mm,
a big kicker for me to be more aware of the fact that maybe everything we do isn't just fine if we're a tourist. Maybe we do need to, I don't know, just like think about there's other things on the planet besides us, you know?
Yep.
It sounds really obvious when you say that, but like,
I know, but like it isn't obvious to people. Like I saw you post yesterday and I reshared it as well, this like long thread about elephants.
yeah,
And like people still are riding elephants. I was just in Thailand and you see ads for it everywhere.
yeah,
And it sounds like wild to you and I that like people cannot question that and just like go and do this without a second thought, but like there really are a lot of people that just have never stopped to think about it, and people love animals. People want to be around them, and so it's very easy to sort of like live in willful ignorance about it, I think.
yeah. I always call it the Snow White effect. Like people just want to kind of sit on a hill surrounded by birds and animals and things, and that's
Yeah.
lovely, but that's not reality. It's not possible to do that with everybody being happy.
Yeah.
Um, so today, anyway, we're going to be talking a little bit about, I guess all of these things we'll probably get into it, but about repeat travel, how it ties into kind of sustainable travel. You're massive on this, right? You love like going back to places.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that and like why you're such a big proponent
Sure.
of it?
Yeah, I think it's important to return to places because visiting one time means you will only ever have that first impression.
Mm.
And realistically, as a tourist, spending a few days or a few weeks or even a month or more in a place, I don't think is enough time to actually get to know it well.
Yeah.
And many countries are so big that like you really just can't experience them with one trip.
Mm.
So I think that returning to places is really important for like getting to know a place and a culture in depth.
Mm.
And I will say, like, when I was younger, I definitely fell into that common trope of the traveler who's like trying to travel as many places as possible, has the attitude of crossing places off a list and never going back. But over the years, I had opportunities to return to places. So, for example, a good friend of mine had immigrated to Ireland. She's still there now. And so I had a catalyst to do repeat visits because, like, I wanted to see her. So I
Yeah.
was going to Ireland a lot. And over time, I just started to realize, like, wow, like, I've really started to love Ireland in a way that I, like, didn't think I could from the first visit.
Yeah.
Like the first visit was very like, oh, I'm a tourist. Like this is great. It's, you know, the first experience. Like it's a very specific experience the first time you go, but like going back repeatedly, I started to experience like what it's like to have familiarity and connections with people in a place. And that sort of like kickstarted my interest in returning to other places as well. And so, yeah, I spent over half of 2024 traveling with my husband, and I think we went to like maybe 7 countries. I'd have to count, but 5 of them were countries we'd been to before that we went to purposefully again because we wanted to experience them
Yeah.
again and in more depth.
That's fantastic. I think there is such like an unknown kind of like it's just lovely. It's so lovely. Like I don't know how else to describe it, but I have something similar. My best friend lives in Brazil, and to get to go back there, it's like quite far removed. I mean, I live in the UK. We don't have experiences like what you can have in Brazil. So of course I wanted to go and do touristy things. But then over time, as I've gone back, I'm like, there's just something about this country that's like genuinely wonderful that doesn't, I don't need to go to Iguazu Falls. I don't need to go to the Pantanal or the Amazon. Like I can just experience it by being in, say, Sao Paulo or in Rio, just being there and enjoying the people and the places. It's almost, I think, it's no better than one side of travel is no better than the other, but it's just completely different.
Yeah, definitely. Luke and I feel this way about Kathmandu. We've spent like so much time there. I've been to Nepal 3 times. He's been twice. And we've spent like over the course of time, like many weeks in Kathmandu. And every time we go, like we have a routine there. We have people we know there. There's places that we go, and like that familiarity is so nice. Like we're past the stage of going to like all the tourist sites because we've done that. Like we enjoyed them. They're amazing. Sometimes we do return to those as well. But it's a city we just like enjoy being in. And it's because we've put time in to understand what to enjoy about it. Um, and it feels like kind of like home in that sense. Like we have the same little hotel that we always go to and like the
Yeah.
same restaurants that we go to where like we recognize the owner and like we don't know if he recognizes us, but like it still makes us happy to like walk in and see his face.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that's like really special and it's a type of travel that's like a little bit different than like doing the tick box travel of just like going to a place and going down your list of all the things you want to see. So I hope that more people want to experience that.
Yeah, I think in our world and society, there's definitely, I don't know where this comes from really, but like there's definitely a feeling of like, we're only given X amount of years. Like you probably want to like experience as many places as you can within that time. And like you, I've been there myself. Like I understand that feeling. I understand that like time slipping away and wanting to see everything, to do everything, but ultimately like we can't do everything in this world. We can't visit everywhere. um and there's kind of a power, I think, in stopping that and saying no, I actually want to see this place for the place and see it differently and go and return.
Yeah, I totally agree. There are people who are trying to go to every country in the world. I'm
Yeah.
very intrigued by these people, but yeah, I just think like it's a different type of experience, and I think there's like a lot of value in the experience of going to places repeatedly.
I mean, every kind of travel, in my opinion, is a privilege. And like however we do it, like it is a privileged way of doing it on both sides. But if you get to travel and you can, like, I don't really know how to phrase it, but there is just something very unique about being able to return as well and have that experience.
Yeah.
Um,
You know what the other thing is too? It's like I think sometimes people chase this experience of like new and having new experiences,
yeah.
but I think why question, if you really liked a place especially, why question whether you should go back? And I always think about this man that I met on a train in India with Luke back in 2017, and we're chatting with him. I think he was American, and we're chatting about India. We're telling him we've been here like a month now, like going into month 2. How long have you been here? And he's like, 6 months. And we're like, wow. And then he's like, yeah, I come every year for 6 months, and I've been doing that for 15 years. And
Wow.
and we were like, oh, like that's so interesting. Like, why do you continue to come back to India? And he was just like, because I really love it, because I have friends here now, and because India is so big, I could do this for the rest of my life and still not really know India.
Yeah.
And Luke and I, like, we were really young and we were just like, wow, that's like so prolific. But now I'm like, it makes total sense. And Luke and I kind of say this ourselves. Like, there's a few places in the world that we know we're going to go back to, like, for the rest of our lives, because we simply just love it there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Even as I said, I live in the UK. The UK is a very small country, comparatively speaking, despite what some people might think of it. But it's really small, and like even then, I'm looking at this country, and I started a while ago like a little series on TikTok for fun of like places you should visit in the UK, or like I think it's like free and fun places to visit in the UK. And I'm like, I could do this till I die. Like there's that many
Yeah.
places, and this is a tiny, tiny island, so everywhere has this something, and especially countries as vast as India or Canada or Russia, the States. Like you really could do it until you just die.
Yeah, you literally could.
Yeah. So that kind of brings me like very nicely to my next question or like point, I guess, which was when we're talking about people who go to places and perhaps share on social media or say things like, I found XYZ a little bit overrated, or they just say, I didn't like it, like straight up. I kind of find that I have quite strong feelings on that, and I know that you do too, because I feel it's not very fair to share like only a negative viewpoint when you because we can only scratch the surface as a tourist. So, what are your feelings on this, and how do you feel it kind of plays into sustainable travel?
Yeah, I think our feelings are like pretty aligned. It's definitely a trend. You see it all the time on TikTok and Instagram and threads of just people posting about places that are overrated or lists of places they wouldn't return to.
Mm.
And yeah, I think these can often be problematic generalizations that are typically rooted in a person's subjective experience, and often their identity as well. Like I find there's a lot of privilege wrapped up in these videos sometimes. And I think like it just these roundups lack nuance around like how a person experiences a place. And then the other issue I have is that most people are spending a few days, a few weeks in a place that they travel to, and I just don't think that that is enough time to make such a sweeping and definitive call about whether it's overrated or about whether you like it.
Mhm.
And I can say this from personal experience. Like I went to Bangkok last November for the second time, and my opinion about it completely changed.
Yeah.
With a second visit, I had a fresh perspective. I spent longer there. I had time to really go slow, and I left Bangkok the second time really in love with it. Whereas the first time, I was like, it's fine. Like, I don't think I'll ever come back here.
Yeah.
So giving places a second chance is like so important.
Yeah.
Like, obviously, everyone is entitled to have their personal preferences, and to form their own opinions based on
Yeah.
their experience. Like, I don't think that is inherently wrong. I just don't think it's a responsible practice to like project
Yeah.
that subjective take like to an audience online, especially without like a lot of context behind it.
Yeah. Really well said. I think this is like two or threefold almost, and like a lot of the points that you've said are like totally valid as well. Um, if for me personally, if I didn't like a place, that's almost a reason to go back. You know,
Mm,
like
yeah.
I feel this way about Cancun. I didn't have a fantastic experience in Cancun. I've been twice. Both times it wasn't that great, but I never scratched beneath the surface. So for me, that's completely me. It's not the destination. It's not, and also when we go to a place like Cancun, for most tourists, is this one strip of like hotels and this, that, and the other. There's actually probably a lot more, and there's definitely a lot more to the Yucatan Peninsula. But people just see that, and that's the association in their mind.
Yeah. You find this a lot with like the resort towns. I feel the same way about Puerto Vallarta, although like I really liked it, but I
Yeah.
stayed away from the tourist strip. Um, but yeah, like you say, like it has to do with like how you experience that place. Like something as simple as like where you decided to stay and also just like subjective experiences like the people you encounter could shape how you feel about a place and those people don't represent an entire country. You will never meet enough people in 2, 3 weeks on a trip to like really be able to make a judgment call about like because this is similar. I also get upset when people are talking about like countries being friendly or
Oh,
like warm compared to others and I'm just like how would you really know that?
yeah,
Like, yes, like it's true that some cultures will appear like more inviting, and that's related to like their cultural practices. Typically, like there's kind people all over the world, and I'm sorry if you didn't meet some in some of the countries you went to, but I
yeah.
don't know if like it's fair to make that judgment call just based on like a couple weeks in a place.
Yeah, so true. I went through a phase where it was shortly after I went to Egypt. Now, I had a fantastic time in Egypt. I had a really good guide. He was absolutely lovely, and he really helped us out with kind of navigating a lot of, I guess, practices in Egypt that are a little bit jarring to tourists, like the tipping and certain aspects of haggling, whatever. Um, And he almost wasn't like a guide at the end, he was like a friend. And I came back full of the joys of spring about Egypt, absolutely singing its praises. And the negative opinions that I encountered online about Egypt, I could not believe it. I was just shocked. Like, people will straight up write in your comments, I didn't like Egypt because the people there suck. And I'm like, how can you say that? Like, it's so unfounded and just rude.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think like people you need to think deeply about like the economic conditions of the place you're in as well, because I find that this is often like a connection is that like people go to a place that isn't as economically strong as where they're from, where people are more where people need to make money and they see tourists as a way to do that. And realistically, tourists are a way to do that. And that creates this dynamic that, like, I think is uncomfortable for people sometimes, but it's just a reality of like how the world is operating at this time.
Yes.
And I think, like, not taking a moment to take a step back and think about like how that's impacting your experience um, is problematic and like it leads to these sweeping generalizations. Because I've heard the same about Egypt and I haven't been, but like I want to go because
Yeah.
like I have talked to people like you who've had incredible experiences there. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
I
And
think we're
I
like pretty aligned on this.
No, definitely. And I think where you said about the privilege, that's where it comes in, right? Like, if we're being honest, the people who are traveling in the world right now, they are the global middle class for the most part. Like, it's people with disposable income or who are going for jobs or for whatever reason. And so there is a privilege that comes with that. And when you go to a country that, as you say, is not as economically strong as your own country, you can have this idea that perhaps, and when I say you, I mean one, um, that perhaps people there are greedy, perhaps they're money grabbing, when the reality is that perhaps they're desperate, perhaps they're just trying to hustle, which people do everywhere. It's just maybe not as obvious. And that's a really good point from you as well, that like there's different circumstances at play. Like, you have, and you can't take everybody as a monolith, like you said earlier as well. Like, you can't look at one person you met or even 10 people you met and say, well, this is representative of the country as a whole, because perhaps you were in areas where this particular kind of person who was on the hustle is prevalent. Perhaps they're all doing the same job and competing against each other. And maybe if you went somewhere where tourists aren't as common, or where they aren't as desperate for money, they aren't as much in need, then you might have a totally different experience.
Yeah, definitely. And I can speak to like personal experience that often is the case in countries that have a reputation for like this kind of like unpleasant experience of being seen as like a source of money.
Yeah. And just quickly on that note as well, because I feel like we could talk about this one forever. When people go and complain of, like, say, um, a begging culture, like people asking for money or people asking for food, and they kind of say, well, it ruined my experience. That to me is inherent privilege. That's like, it's pretty outrageous to say that when you think about the fact that like people are so desperate that they're actually asking for money, and tourists are a very obvious target for that. Now, that may not be pleasant, but that doesn't mean that these people are not nice or that they're not friendly. They're just trying to survive.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It is a very self-centering like practice. And like I've talked about this on my channels a lot as well, is like tourists love to center themselves in their experience. And it's honestly like not our fault as
Yeah,
individual tourists because like the tourism industry really is built around like centering the tourist.
yeah,
But I think like all of us could benefit from sort of like removing ourselves as like sort of the center of the experience and thinking about like the people we're encountering and their experience and how like my presence or your presence as a tourist is impacting them and what we are to them, what we represent to them.
yeah, and how we can empower them rather than anything else. That's a brilliant point. So I guess, if from my perspective, for social media in particular, this is something I think people use like this, oh, it's overrated, or it's, I didn't like it. They kind of use this controversial language to deliberately be controversial and to almost seek out to annoy people. But in my opinion, it goes beyond that. It's not something that should kind of be used just to like, further your own gains, get more views. It is still damaging. So in your opinion, like, what could people be saying instead? Like, how could they take a more nuanced approach to this?
The kind of content that I would love to see on social media is not the content that's going to go viral. And
Likewise.
I know, like from my own time on Instagram and like growing my audience there, like I've seen for myself what kind of content performs and what doesn't. And unfortunately, rage baiting and saying controversial things is what gets a lot of views. In a perfect world, I would love to see people just like sharing content that has context. So if you had a bad experience in a place, I don't think it's a bad thing to share that. I think if you want to share it, you should share it with context about like who you are, how long you were there, like why it was bad specifically, what led to it being bad. Um, I think just like coloring your experience with like all of that context is really important because it emphasizes that it's a subjective experience instead of this like sweeping generalization. Um, and yeah, I like, I don't know, I wish I could like reach out to all the people that are posting these videos and say, hey, like, why don't you give it a second shot? Like, go back again. But I don't know if they would.
Yeah. And for me as well, it's also thinking about accessibility again. Like some people are not going to read your caption. Some people are just going to watch your reel. Um, and if your reel is designed to be a clickbaity hook, and then your caption is explaining the nuance, sometimes that's not good enough. Like people just won't they won't read that. Like again, I'm not meaning to preach about how people should share their content, but I think a lot of times when people do share this kind of content, they then get very upset that they got so much like hate or rage. And it's like, well, that's because of how you shared it.
hmm And listen, I'm in the social media space. Like, I see people sharing this as a strategy,
Yeah.
like, put something without context in the copy in the video and direct people to the caption because it keeps people running the video longer, which is better for your metrics. And yeah, I see the strategy shared all over the place. Like, I'm sure people remember, like, a couple months ago, it was all about like the 3 second or 6 second video. This is all about like earning views. And I think this is probably the root reason why people do it because like they want to grow. Everyone wants to grow on Instagram. They want like a massive audience. They want to become influencers. And yeah, it's frustrating that the algorithm like rewards content like this rather than like more in-depth contextualized content because like there are creators out there that I know who are doing this kind of content. Um, and they're doing well. Like I think it is possible. It's just like it's a very specific audience that will appreciate this kind of content, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to say is that I also think it's not just up to, because obviously content creators have a huge responsibility. They've got big platforms online usually, even if they don't, like they've got big potential to be seen. Like, when people talk about, oh, I only had 1,500 views on this video, like, what are you talking about? That's 1,500 people who saw your video. Um,
Yeah.
so I don't only think it's content creators though who have this responsibility. Like I do think there's also a responsibility from the general public to firstly not be so gullible. Like if you see a reel like that and or a video or a picture, whatever, and you think, oh well, that must be true. Like this person that I've seen online said it. Maybe do a little bit more digging or think like actually perhaps I could experience this for myself. Like people online are not gospel. Um, and secondly, from the general public to not engage with that kind of content. Like if you do see something that's perhaps not nuanced, that's maybe a little bit unfair, kind of learn that social media is rewarding what you're doing, which is taking the bait, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I do think people can curate like their feed to contain more contextualized content. It's just a matter of like going out and engaging with that kind of content so that it's what the algorithm knows to feed to you ultimately.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. There is definitely a way of doing that, and it's easier than you think. Like watching a few videos, you can end up with a whole curated feed that, perhaps you didn't even want. So do that for the
Yeah.
videos you do want to see.
I always tell people like this is why I said like I'm a blogger first because I became a blogger because I like long form
Yeah.
content. I wanted to be able to write 4,000 words about my experience and not be creating 10-second videos about it. But unfortunately, to be like a creator in this space, you need to have a presence everywhere. I sort of accidentally grew an audience on social media and I hate it. Like, I love my community on Instagram, but I don't particularly like creating content for Instagram, which is kind of funny because, like, I also am very into photography, but like, also like photography doesn't perform that well online. So it just feels like you're constantly having to like feed into like what the algorithm wants.
Yeah.
Um, and ultimately, like, I wish more people would just like be reading like multiple blogs about a place before they go and like, yeah, just doing more like long form research versus like basing everything off of these videos that they see online. I think these videos can be like a good starting point in some cases. And like, I do like, I try to create like more contextualized content for Instagram. Like, I hope that people like it and find inspiration in that. But I do think like you should always take it a step further and look to other resources as well that are a bit more in depth.
Yeah, and that have other viewpoints as well. So when you're talking about blogging, and like I feel the same way, like I could honestly, I could ramble on for like 6,000 words about absolutely nothing. And I often look back at it and think, no one's interested in that. But but it is this idea of like the long form content. You can put more nuance. You can say who you are as well. Like you have caption space to, because I exhaust my caption space on every post on Instagram, but on a blog, you can sort of do an introduction, say, like, for me, for example, I'm a white woman. I often travel with a white partner. We are in a heterosexual relationship. Like, I'm bisexual myself, but our relationship is heterosexual. So, in terms of privilege, I'm really speaking from one of the highest ends of the scale here. So, when I write my blogs, if I then dive into safety or like the other things that we've already talked about in this podcast, but in terms of like safety, liking a place, that kind of thing, like it's always going to be coming from a place of privilege. And as much as I wish I could help other people, that's not my place. And it's good to know like who I am, what I'm speaking about, and why. So, from a blogging perspective, then what should we be doing that would really help readers understand if they can like if they can take our word as useful for them or if they need to seek additional resources as well.
I think it's exactly what you just said. It's like providing the context about your subjective experience, like about why you've had the experience that you've had. Like, for example, in my blogs, to be honest, I kind of avoid talking about safety at all because I don't want someone to make a decision based on my experience about whether a place feels safe for them or not.
Yeah.
And part of that is because, like, for the same reasons, like, I'm often traveling with my husband, like, we are a white heterosexual relationship, and that changes my experience in places. I know this for a fact because I used to travel solo all the time, and the change in experience, like from solo to traveling with a white man, is
Yeah.
like extreme. And so, yeah, when I do comment on things like that, like it's always bolded, like this is based on my experience which is based on my identity, and then sharing exactly what that identity is.
Yeah.
Um, for me, like what I love about blogging, like long form, is that like in my blogs, I try to weave in a lot of like subtle advice about how to visit a place in a more responsible way. And I think this is the beauty of long form is that like I'm using it as a tool to also educate people. I do create these sort of like run-of-the-mill travel guides, like how to spend 5 days in Toronto. But in that guide, I include a lot of these like subtle tips that are
Yeah.
reminding people like how to be respectful while you're in Toronto. Um, and yeah, it's sort of like my way of trying to like encourage people to think about the way that they're traveling and the way that they're visiting a place and engaging with that place. So that's the beauty of it for me. And like you said, like with long form, you just have a lot more space to share important context, to share some like historical background, to share some cultural practices.
Yeah.
And then again, just like important reminders about how to like be a respectful visitor when you're in a place.
Yeah, it's so nice to hear you say that because I do exactly the same. And I often think I shouldn't be sharing like a just a run of the mill guide because like my page is about responsible travel, same as you. But then I do that, I kind of like sneak bits in where I'll be like talking about something and I'll be like, oh, by the way, here's some tips for being like a responsible snorkeler or like and it's it definitely gives you more space to do that and to get people thinking about it. Um
Well, this is how we have to hack the algorithm, right?
yeah,
Because this is what people are looking for. Realistically, like I do a lot of SEO, so I know how people are engaging with search, and most people are not looking for responsible tourism guides.
I know it.
They're looking for an itinerary to tell them how to spend 48 hours in a place. And so the first thing I'll write in a 48-hour itinerary is 48 hours is not enough time. You should really spend like 5 days if you can.
Yeah.
Um, so it's about just like using these search terms that people are like actively looking for and then like sneaking into that content these little like nuggets to get them to start thinking and considering perspectives that maybe they haven't thought about yet.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is actually a great tip because when we were saying, if these people really want to go viral and they're using, unfortunately, I guess we could call them unethical hooks in this way, there is a way to do it. Like, share the guides that people are searching for. Think about SEO. Think like all social media has SEO as well. So use that, but then put your voice on it, put your spin and say who you are and say what you think people should be doing to visit responsibly. I guess we
Yeah.
should say in this as well that when we're talking about responsible tourism, obviously a lot of that is informed by locals that we speak to, what kind of they are saying. And again, like local people are not a monolith. So when we're speaking to one local person, perhaps 10 other local people think differently. And again, it's all opinions.
Yeah. At the end of the day, it always is.
Yeah. Well, I guess it is, but if enough people are saying it, then we can
Yeah.
take that forward.
It's definitely important to get like the opinions of many people to sort of find like because within that you'll find like the truth basically is what
Yeah.
I would assume. But I do always tell people like if you can like find a blogger or a creator who is local to the place that you're going to because like they know better than me. They will always know better than me. And this is actually a disclaimer that I often put in my blogs. Like I will say, this is how long I spent here. And this is based on my experience, like my limited experience in this place. And like I was here as a tourist. I can't speak to what local life is like. Because that's another big qualm to me is like when people make these claims about what local life is like when they've only been there for like a couple weeks.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do put a lot of these sort of like quote unquote disclaimers in my content about like the context of what I was doing there, how long I was there, who I am. I think that's really important in this kind of content.
Yeah, I do feel for people. I think it takes a lot of integrity to do what you do and to be like, I'm maybe ranking on Google, but ultimately like you could look to another source as well as me to compare. And I think often people don't want to divert from their page or from their post because they really like they need that. And ultimately like it is people's jobs. So it's hard to judge. But I guess if you can do this, like this is much better for the place. Um, and then I guess one last point on this. So this isn't just people online. It's not just when they're sharing, but it can also apply to like when people come home from, say, trips or speaking to their friends and relatives. It can be so easy to go straight to, oh, well, I didn't have a good time because of XYZ, or I enjoyed like this, that, and the other, but not this. Um, how do you feel about it when it's talking to friends and family and that kind of thing?
Maybe I'm lucky, but like everyone I talk to just only has good things to say
Aw.
about the places they go. Um, I'm trying to think.
See now, I'm British and people do not only have good things to say.
I honestly don't know if I've, like in recent history at least, I don't know if I've had anyone like tell me that they didn't enjoy a trip they went on. I mean, I kind of have a joke like with my family because like my parents, I didn't travel a lot with my parents as a kid. They didn't have the money for us to travel. They had three kids, but they traveled a lot before they had us. And my
Mhm.
parents were always like, "Yeah, we just love everywhere we go." Like
Aw.
it's kind of like a mindset. And I've like posted about this on social media. I feel like I'm like a love it all traveler. Like I will always find a reason to love a place. Like even if I'm having the worst time, like just bad things are happening to me, like I will always leave loving a place. Like I can't think of one place that I like wouldn't go back to. So maybe it's just the energy I'm putting out into the world. But now I'm gonna like take note and see if someone like in the future talks to me about a place that they didn't like.
I feel like I need that energy. I mean, it's definitely a British thing to come home and sort of speak the negatives first because we don't want to like show off.
Yeah.
Um, but it's such a nice thing to only see the positives. So where then would you say, like, let's switch this totally positive. Like, where would you say are the best places that you have seen when you've gone back to them, like repeat travel destinations, or where's kind of totally changed your opinion on a second visit?
Well, most recently, and I touched on this already, definitely Bangkok. And I think this had everything to do about like how I visited. Like the first time I was there, it was kind of like a stopover. I had been in Thailand. I was traveling onward to India, so I was really only in Bangkok to catch a flight to India. And
Mhm.
so I was there for like 3 days. I was staying in a very low budget hostel, not in the best neighborhood. I I have like really severe food allergies and I had like a minor reaction while I was in
Mhm.
Bangkok. So like I was in the hospital. I had like a rash all over my face.
No.
They were all like things that were just unfortunate, like to have happened in those 3 days. Like it had nothing to do with Bangkok or Thailand.
Mhm.
But it did color like my experience. And I left being like, I didn't like it here that much. But like, of course I didn't like it. I was sick and
Yeah.
I was only there for like 3 days and I didn't really have time because of like what was happening, to be there like as a tourist and like go see things.
Yeah.
So on my most recent trip, I was in the city for just over 2 weeks. I stayed like in the same place, like the same apartment for the whole 2 weeks. And I had time to like go slow and really get to know the city, like go from neighborhood to neighborhood, see like many, many temples, see many museums. Um, yeah, it was just like a slower pace. I wasn't sick,
Yeah.
so it was like, yeah, a completely different experience. And by the time I left, I was like, wow, I really love this city. Like, I would like to come back here. So adding it to the list of places that I will repeatedly visit in the future.
Love that.
And yeah, I mean, other places like we also repeat visited Japan this year.
Mhm.
Um, and on our first trip, we had done sort of the classic trip, like the Golden Triangle, Tokyo, Osaka, Kyoto. And on this trip, because we had done all that already, we decided, okay, let's like go more into the countryside. So we went to places like Takayama and Kanazawa. Um, and yeah, oh, and we went to Hiroshima. We went to
Wow.
places that like most people don't have time for on their first trip.
Mhm.
And it was a completely different experience, like especially because we weren't really in the big cities as much. Um, the lifestyle in the countryside of Japan is very different. It's a very different pace, and the nature of Japan is incredible. We hadn't really experienced that on our first trip because we were mostly in cities. So it just gave us like a different perspective, and we just fell more in love with Japan. So that's also another country we know we will repeatedly go back to. Nepal, like I've mentioned, I absolutely love Nepal. I will go back over and over and over. And then this year we also repeat visited Iceland. Similarly, like the first trip we did to Iceland was sort of like the classic trip, like the south coast. And then on this trip, we went to the most remote region of the island, which is the West Fjords, which is a completely different experience. I
Mhm.
think like the nice thing about a repeat trip is like your first trip, you're always going to want to do sort of the classic itinerary.
Yeah.
When you go back, you have a chance to go beyond that, and it often is such a different experience. So even just going to a place twice, I think is valuable just for that, to have the chance to go beyond the classic itinerary.
Mm. When I was 19, I lived in Tanzania. And I lived there for about 3 months, and then I've been back more times than I can even count. I don't even think I've done the highlights, quote unquote, the highlights. Like I've never climbed Kilimanjaro. I've actually never been to the Serengeti. I've been to Ngorongoro, and I've been to Zanzibar, but like it's mainly just me hanging out with my friends. And yeah, I
Yeah.
love it. Like I love everything about that experience because I've had some really random experiences that people don't really get that when they go for the first time, of course, because they're just because they're trying to get through a series of tick boxes, like you said. So you kind of
Hmm.
miss the stuff that's not really worth writing home about, but it's just as valuable in other ways.
Yeah. And I like to always say too, like, I don't fault people for wanting to be a tourist when
No.
they're a tourist. It is okay to want to see, like, our first trip to Japan, we wanted to see Tokyo. We wanted to experience Kyoto.
Mhm.
Um, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Like, it is just the reality of being a tourist, and it's okay to be a tourist. And the reality too is like a lot of people don't have tons of time. Like, I'm extremely privileged to have the time that I have to travel. Um, my partner and I make it like a real priority in our lives. We're willing to quit jobs to go travel. Um, it's just like the lifestyle we've built for ourselves. But like a lot of people are working with like 10 days of PTO a year. If you're
Yeah.
American, that's probably what you have to work with. And so, in that context, like I understand why someone traveling somewhere is going to do more of the tick box style travel. When you have limited time, you're going to want to just be a tourist when you're on vacation. So yeah, but I do always say to those people, like, you can always do your 2 weeks a little bit slower instead of like 2 days in every place. And even if you have 2 weeks, like you could go to the same country every year for a couple years.
Yeah.
It's hard to sell people on that, but you could.
People don't love that. I think for me, I mean, it's true they could, and I'm sure they would love it. That's kind of the sad thing. But
Mm,
I mean, two things, like I said, one form of travel is not better than the other. So exactly like you just said, like there's no judgment for people who want to be a tourist. We're all tourists somewhere. And yeah, the second thing is slow travel you touched on there doesn't mean 6 months in a country. Like it could just mean, right, I've got 2 weeks. I'm going to go to two places instead of six places.
yes. This is like a big qualm I have with like the slow travel movement. Like I find that it's always framed as like spend months in a place or like weeks in a place. And this goes back to like sort of the accessibility thing we've touched on already in this discussion. Like, I think like we have to balance sustainability practices with like the reality of life for most people,
Yeah.
which is life under capitalism. Most people don't have 6 months a year to slow travel. And so we need to find like a balance. And that balance, like you said, it's like when I talk to people who are going to Europe and they have 2 weeks and they're telling me I'm gonna go to like six different cities in six different countries. I always say like, well, what if you do like three cities and all in the same country, or like just cut it down a little bit and like spend less time moving from place to place and more time like actually getting to know each city. That to me like is still slow travel,
Yeah.
especially given that like most people spend an average of 3 days in every place that they go to. If you can spend 5 days, like that's already a lot slower and will have a huge impact on your experience.
Yeah. And you can build in these big hitter experiences with the more relaxed pace. Um,
Hmm.
Definitely this like, and I don't like the term, but bucket list kind of lifestyle has really changed people's perspective of travel, and it is in some ways a little unfortunate.
Hmm.
Um, so this is going to be a really broad question, and you've already touched on part of it, but for my kind of the last thing that I wanted to ask you is for you personally, what does sustainable travel or responsible travel, like those two terms, what do they mean for you as succinctly as you can?
I think that sustainable tourism is really just about acknowledging the harms of tourism and the tourism industry. And I think it's about creating models of tourism that account for these harms, that take these negative impacts and find ways to counter them in an effort to protect people and the planet. Because, like, for tourism to be sustainable, these places still need to exist and still need to exist in like the way that they're meant to. Um, yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but
It does.
basically, like, I guess, like, in really simple terms, it's just like acknowledging the harms of tourism and doing something about it. But, like, from a more philosophical sense, like, I would just see sustainable tourism as like this urge to create a better model of tourism. Because we do talk a lot about like the way that we as individual tourists are like traveling and engaging with tourism, but like at the end of the day, like the tourism industry really needs to change. And I think like as tourists. We are consumers of this industry. Um, Being a sustainable tourist is also about like trying to change that, trying to encourage these models to change and using our dollars to do that. Because yeah, the model is a lot of the problem. It's a lot of what feeds into why people travel in the way that they do. Um, so yeah, that's kind of like a bigger, scary problem, but I think it's important to mention.
Yeah, no, that was really well said because I always say if anybody ever asked me this question, I would just ramble on for about an hour and we'd never get anything done. But I think, as you've said, the acknowledgement is it's so important. And I think to acknowledge that tourism is extractive in general, or used to be at least, I think people feel it puts a lot of guilt and shame on them. And I feel very strongly that that's not the point of sustainable tourism or responsible tourism. The point isn't to make you feel bad for traveling, it's to acknowledge that harm has been done by the industry on a more than individual level, on like a large scale level. And if we want to be able to continue to travel, like if we want it to keep going, then we need to change it as a whole.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's tough because I think like making people feel shame and guilt about themselves as like individuals in these ecosystems, like it's a great distraction. It's a great distraction from the actual problem,
Yeah.
which often like just boils down to big companies.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I see a lot of people in not so much as travel space, but like in the sustainability space who are kind of determined to make people feel ashamed. And I do understand why they I understand what they're doing. In my opinion, though, it just does not work. Like if you have somebody who is feeling maybe I want to make a change, maybe I'm interested in progressing to the next step. And then you say to them something along the lines of, well, yeah, but you haven't even considered XYZ, you're still doing Y. And it's like that just is never going to convince anybody. You're just going to turn away a potentially willing ally, and make them not
Yeah.
interested in your cause.
Yeah, we've talked about this on my podcast a couple times, like the concept of calling in versus calling out, how
Yeah.
important it is to make this information accessible and to avoid like using shame and guilt as a tool to like encourage people to change. It just creates conflict and like conflict isn't productive. I
Mhm.
think it's like really important to call people in a gentle way. And this is why like my approach is just to like try to educate really subtly, just to like slowly open people up to the idea instead of like making them like feel horrible about the way that they've traveled for however long. I just don't know that it's like a productive approach.
Yeah, stealth education. I like it.
Yeah.
But it's true because I think, I mean, I'm sure you're in the same boat as me. I've done things in the past where I wouldn't dream of doing them now. Like I know that they
Yeah.
can be harmful, but how can you know until you know?
Exactly. Yeah. And I also always tell people like it's not one size fits all. I think like and I'm guilty of it too. Like I do create these lists of like ways to be a more responsible tourist. Like here's 6 simple things you can do. Um, I don't think it's fair to have the expectation that everyone can like do all of those 6 things on every single trip.
Mhm.
Because again, like it goes back to like subjective experience and like your identity. So for example, like I tell people to eat in local restaurants, but I often cannot because I
Yeah.
have very severe food allergies. My life is on the line. Sometimes for me, the safest option to eat is to go to McDonald's. And
Yeah.
while I would never tell people to do that from a responsible tourism perspective, for me as an individual, like my life is at risk here.
Yeah.
And I sometimes cannot make the most sustainable choice, unfortunately. Do I try to whenever I can? Yes, but I think it's like really important to acknowledge that like the same framework isn't going to work for every person. And it's the same, like I talk sometimes to teachers who are like, well, the only time I can travel is during the summer, so I can't do off-season travel. I often tell people like travel in the the off season or the shoulder season. And like for them, it's not possible. The time that they have off is during the time, which is typically high season in many places.
Mhm.
And so that's not a choice that is available to them.
Yeah.
So I always like to say this because I think it's like really important to acknowledge that and just like encourage people to do what they can within their own framework.
Yeah, yeah, I absolutely agree. I think there are people in this space, if I'm being honest, who I think do sometimes use like maybe not excuses is the wrong word, but like they don't want to do something, so they will find a reason they can't. But more often than not, people really would do it if they could. Like it's just a case that they either they don't know or they can't. Like with you, like of course you can't go and eat in a local restaurant if you would literally die. Like it's if you don't have like a fantastic grasp on the language, or perhaps the understanding isn't there in whatever country that you're traveling to, then that is that you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't put your life at risk in that way. And why not go somewhere where you can be sure of the ingredients? It's much, much safer. Similarly, like for me, even as recently as last month, I always take the ferry to Ireland. I have family there. And I do that every single time. And I was going this last time for a wedding. It was just a brief visit. We were only there for 4 days. And the ferry was cancelled because of storms in the UK. And we didn't find out until we were literally like at the port. So
Oh no.
so our only choice is we have to fly. Like it's either that or
Yeah.
we turn around and go 4 hours down the country, which we wouldn't have made the next ferry. So again, these things happen. Like no one wants, or I think some people do, but of the two of us, we're not expecting perfection. Like that's
Yeah.
unreasonable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
So anything else to say on this topic before I round us off?
Oh, like I could go on and on forever. So no, I'll stop it there. But thank you. Like it's been really fun to chat through this with you. I just knew from our interactions on Threads and Instagram that like I would enjoy chatting with you, and I really have. So thanks for inviting me on.
Yeah, come back anytime. No, definitely. I can, sometimes you can just tell that someone really has like very shared opinions with you. So, but I think this was informative. I hope it wasn't just us kind of yes anding each other all the way through. Um, so Erin, then tell us what are you, I mean, I know you're always working on something. So what are you working on at the moment and where can people find you?
I'm working very actively on new episodes for my podcast, Curious Tourism. So you can find that wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm also, of course, always writing blogs and generally pretty active on Instagram and Threads. Sometimes TikTok, not so much anymore. I think it's probably going down the drain here in Canada. I'm not sure it'll exist in the next 6 months. So
Yeah.
yeah, for the most part, Instagram and Threads. And yeah, my handle is Pina Travels, Pina Travels.
Amazing. It will be just down here. Um, so yeah, thank you so much for listening. This has been the Sustainable Travel Podcast. You can find us on Instagram at the Sustainable Travel Podcast. Please do give us a review on Spotify and follow along. And we also have a Facebook group which is called Sustainable Travel Tips Group. Thank you so much.